Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Business of Joy. And I have another very exciting guest that I think everybody's going to learn so much from, Rita McGrath. Welcome.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I will just tell a quick story. You and I just literally met at the Reinvention Summit in Dublin. And I know all the listeners out there, they've been hearing me talk about it. But as soon as I heard you, not only in your keynote, but also in the panel, I was like, I have got to get her on the show and have her share all of these amazing stories. So welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Lisa.
Yes, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell everybody a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I'm Rita McGrath, a longtime educator at Columbia Business School. My work is typically at the intersection of strategy and innovation with a sprinkling of entrepreneurship in there. Right now I've been sort of looking at the future of what organizations could be like that have to adapt to these times of real transition and uncertainty.
Well, say that again. So it's strategy, innovation sprinkled in with entrepreneurship. I love that. So I can visualize it, which is also why those three things really resonate with me as well. Well, I love to start with people's really origin stories. And one of my favorite questions is understanding your first job. Most people start with their job out of college. I want to know the first job, whether it was paid or not, when it was little Rita.
Well, I guess my first job, I guess, would have been babysitting. That was the thing that you did in the suburbs when I was growing up. And then my first sort of real job, like with an entity, I was a part-time receptionist for an optician.
Oh,
A guy named George Bisnet in Webster, New York. And back in the day, so he had a regular full-time receptionist, but he also had hours sort of into the evening and on the weekends. And those were the hours that I took because I could work them around school. And George was such a character. He was a chain smoker. So he would go from room to room in the office, and there'd be like a cigarette in the front room, and there'd be a cigarette in the back
oh my
room.
goodness.
And his offices were in this converted house, basically. And so twice a year, it was my job to try to help deep clean the place. And so we
Mm.
took the shades on the window up to the bathtub that was upstairs in the house where the office was. And because of all the smoking, you had to like soak them in the bathtub, and all this yellow gunk would just come
Oh
off. And it
yeah.
feels to me, as I'm saying this, it feels like I'm talking from another era, which I guess it was because
It
you would never have that
No
today.
kidding. Well, yeah, no kidding. But that's where I think everybody, those early stories I think are just so interesting. And, because even just phones, I mean, the reality, okay, because obviously, were there multiple lines on the phone or was it the dial phone? Like, because nowadays, people don't even know what a dial phone looks
I
like.
know it was. I think it was a push button phone, as I
Okay.
recall, and there were multiple lines on it. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So then you had to. So any lessons learned from being that receptionist, Rita?
Oh, it was. Well, it was a really interesting time. So it was Webster, New York, which is a suburb of Rochester,
Mhm.
and you had a lot of our clientele would have been Kodak employees, and
Mm.
so every March you had the Kodak bonus, and there was never a question of whether there would be a bonus or not. I mean, it was a very stable, very kind of thing, and people would come in for their eyeglasses and their kids. Whatever, and they'd be spending their Kodak bonus. So we always used to sort of really staff up for sort of March, April, because that was when the bonus would happen and people would come in and we knew we were really busy. One of my biggest memories was back then, contact lenses were first becoming feasible for ordinary people. And one of the things that was the case was that for a lot of older people, contact lenses offered them a solution that they couldn't have employed with regular glasses, right? It was a different solution when they started to have cataracts or they had surgery. And one of the things I was tasked with was teaching them how to put these contact lenses in and take them out of their eyes. So it
Oh
was
my
a
goodness.
sort of empathy, and you had to be able to tell whether the lens was the right way around, like holding it up and seeing whether it was the right way around or not.
Oh
So it was a very
my
human kind of job. And George put enormous faith in me. In fact, once we did an office remodel, and he actually was creating a separate little kind of almost like a studio where he would set up some of his equipment, and he let me design the design on the outside of the studio, which was set up in the office. So he gave me a lot of responsibility.
I was just gonna say that, Rita, because you think about it, that's pretty incredible. And how old were you back then?
Oh, I
Round
would have been in high
figures.
school, so I would have been what, 16, 17, that age.
That's incredible. But I think that those are so interesting, right? Because as a teenager, you had incredible responsibility when you think about it. And it kind of really makes a lot of sense where you fast forward that kind of challenges. I mean, having to teach older people contact lenses, that's an innovation. That's an empathy to your point. And then just the accountability of remodel at such a young age. And I think that's fascinating in today's world. I don't think, maybe that's part of the issue with younger generation is are the bosses giving those younger people enough challenge to let them go and just do stuff,
Mhm.
right? Versus, are we really challenging teenagers enough in their early jobs? Maybe not. I don't
I
know.
have a friend, Jonathan Haidt, who teaches at NYU, and he recently wrote this book, The Anxious Generation. And
Mm.
before that, he had a book about how we're sort of raising these kids to be sort of wrapped in bubble wrap. And I'm kind of with you. I think, we kind of fell into this sort of trying to protect kids from every possible thing that might go wrong. And so everything's organized. You don't have play dates anymore. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, we would just roam free in the neighborhood, and my family was famous for having a gong. So at dinner time, my mother would get this great big gong, and she'd like stand out on the front porch and she'd bang the gong, and all the neighbors knew it was time for the Gunther kids to come home because it was dinner time, but she didn't know where we were.
That's
And
hilarious.
I can't even conceive of parents today giving their kids that much freedom. And yet I think we lose something when kids aren't just allowed to go play and invent and try things out on their own.
Well, that's where you do you learn the failures and the struggles, but you don't really think about it because it's just play. We
Mhm.
in my neighborhood, we lived in a suburban neighborhood with the four fences, right? But our best friends were the catty corner, and so my parents and the friends' parents, they talked to the neighbors, and they cut a hole like a little gate in the fence. On the neighbor to the side, so we could go catty corner behind us without having to walk all around the building. But yeah, we just went out in that structure, unstructure, which I think is amazing. But let me ask, kind of sticking with those early days, there's two questions. So let's go with this one first. Was there some kind of in early years, maybe you were 9, 10, 11, 12, this kind of defining moment or memory that just really stands out to you today that, might have shaped and influenced who you are?
Oh, well, yeah, I guess so. From that early stage. So my mother, my mother was a microbiologist. My dad was an organic chemist. Um,
Wow.
my mother, when I was born in New Haven, and they were both working at the Yale Medical School at the time.
Hmm.
And so my mother would work a 4-day week. And so she had Fridays that she could spend with me and then later on with my brother. When they eventually moved from New Haven to Rochester, and I remember when they moved, she decided just temporarily to stop work. And I remember coming home, and it was just so unusual for me to find her there,
Yeah.
every day. It was just amazing. And I guess this idea that a woman could both be very independent, but also choose to commit some of that time to her family, even though she had this incredible PhD, and her work is still being cited. I mean, she did some of the very, very earliest work on self-repairing DNA,
Oh,
which decades and decades later ended up winning the subsequent people who followed up on that research a Nobel Prize. So she was actually part of one of the groups at Yale that was exploring self-repairing DNA. And at the time, nobody believed it. It was so counter to the prevailing paradigm that there was actually a case where she couldn't publish her research because the sponsors were so worried that it was so contrary to current
okay.
belief,
So this is where, okay, so
like
that was,
costing their grants.
yeah, so that's about the repairing DNA, but now I know where you get your DNA because you think about those that intersection of what you just said about obviously having both parents in academia, but then also the fact that they were very out, blazing new trails, I guess, for lack of a better word. But I love the humanity, though, too. If when your mom was actually home, that's actually pretty funny too. When that was a change, if that was home. So that's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. And I want to ask, kind of this whole thing is, do you know, like, when growing up, where was that ambition? Because you're very driven, which I love that, and just blazing the trails yourself. But that challenge and ambition and trying new things, where did that come from in you?
Oh, I guess it was never really a question. I remember my dad telling me once, since I was born in the United States, you could grow up to become president. Um, I think the sort of challenge of being excellent in whatever you did, it was just kind of taken for granted in my house. And I think for me, one of my core values really is independence. And
Mm.
I think the way that as an individual you get independence is is being ambitious enough to call your own shots, to earn your own income, to not be dependent on other people. And I think that's a very strong value for me. So that's probably part of.
Yeah, that's my parents. I remember when my grandmother, my mom's mom passed away, we were sitting in the Pensacola airport or Sarasota airport, and we were talking about being a mom. And I'm the youngest of three, and I remember her telling me as a job, my job is to help you find your path to be independent. And the other thing she said, which also sticks out, is you have to know how to make decisions. And if you can't make decisions, you can never be independent, right? So just thought that was a very interesting story. But were there any teachers in your either college days or high school days that like unconventional teachers that stood out for you?
Um, Well, I guess they all had something to contribute in a way. I guess in college, one of the most formative ones, well, there were two that come to mind. One was a gentleman named Richard Pius. So I went to college at Barnard College in New York City. And he was known for being really tough. And
Mm.
so in the course of a semester, we had to write two 5-page papers, and then the final paper was a 20-page paper. Now, to
Mm.
take a typical high school kid, this is like, what?
That's a lot. 20
I
pages
just
for a high
told,
school? 20
yeah,
pages for a high school? That's crazy.
I know. Well, he was a college professor,
Yeah.
and he he basically said this is your this is like how you're going to hone your craft. And
Mm.
it was, we were famous for pulling all-nighters and working in his class. But I think one of the benefits of that was it really was almost like a crucible. You worked really, really hard. But I would say, to his credit, he read the papers. He gave very detailed feedback. This is where this is strong. This is where this isn't. So another thing that I did as a freshman, which was really stupid, was I decided to take a master's degree class in Russian history. And
In Russian history?
Russian history of all
Oh
things.
my gosh.
What propelled me to do that? But this is a master's level class, and I was a college freshman, which was kind of stupid. Uh, so, obviously the paper, the class was just way beyond what I was able to accomplish at that time. And so by the middle of the course, I just really wasn't doing very well at all. So I went and had a one-on-one with the professor, and I said, well, it's kind of too late for me to drop this class. I do need it, and I'm not doing very well. What can I do? And she was really, really sweet. She said, look, I understand. I didn't realize you were just a college freshman. I thought you were a
In your
regular.
master's class.
So she gave me the option of writing an additional paper in addition to the regular prescribed coursework. And she said, if you really do a good job on this paper, I'll see what I can do about adjusting your grade before the end of the term. And so she assigned me the topic, and I will never forget it. It was were the Bolsheviks under Lenin monolithic?
Oh my goodness. That's
And
not an easy one.
I had So I had to do all this additional research, and did put together this paper, and it did. She liked it, and that was another big lesson because it was. don't give up, right? Just because you're not doing well doesn't mean you sort of throw up your hands and slink into a corner. There's probably some way that you can address the situation. And I think that was a big lesson that came out of that.
Well, and there's a lot because even the fact that you took the class, that you signed up for the class is a leap, which also just says, you're comfortable pushing outside your comfort zone, but then asking for help is another part of it, and then not giving up. So there's multiple really lessons in that. And again, I think there's so much opportunity to instill that in the next generation to say it's that those struggles, all those things that you learned are invaluable in life. So I think that's pretty incredible. Well, I want to ask, I know you were also at Microsoft for a little bit, but then you chose to come back to academia. So I would love to hear the story about, was it a magnet that was just drawing you back into the academia? Like what made you want to go back?
Well, I wasn't employed at Microsoft. I was a part of the Microsoft CEO Summit design team for many years.
Yes.
No, my first job out of my master's degree was actually in government. I worked for the city of New York in the highly glamorous area of public procurement. I believe that.
That's funny.
And the thing about government service is that if you're young and you're ambitious and you're willing to work hard, your career just goes like a rocket ship for the first few years.
Yeah.
But then you reach a plateau, and you sort of look at the next 50 years and it could all be the same thing. And
Mm,
so, and I'd also just gotten married. We were on the brink of starting a family, and I was trying to figure out what would my next step be. So,
mm.
I could have just decided to stay there and
Yeah.
have a fine career in public service. But at the time, business schools were taking off, and there was a big push to get people with PhDs in the front of the classroom. And a friend of mine was doing her PhD at NYU. And I'd sort of thought about academia. I've always, and I mean, I grew up in a house where the solution to everything was found in a book. So that wasn't sort of foreign to me. Uh,
Yeah.
she said, no, really, business school is taking off. It's a really interesting field. I'd always been kind of interested in business. I remember when, Peters and Waterman's book first came out, In Search of Excellence, and I was very
Oh,
drawn.
great book. Yeah. Classic. Hmm.
Yeah, but it was, what interested me was the organizations and the people in them and how they made decisions, and I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. So, so she suggested, she said, well, why don't you apply? It doesn't, it's not expensive to do that, and then see what happens. And my husband basically said, hey, if you get into a top five school, it's worth doing, and if you don't, it's not.
Yeah.
Applied and got into the Wharton School in Philadelphia. So we decided to move to Princeton, which is
Mm.
speaking to you from, and I commuted south and he commuted north. And it turned out to be a great place to raise our kids. And when I got the job at Columbia after I graduated, then I just commuted, and we discovered that moving from an apartment to a house as a couple is very, very easy. Moving from a house back to an apartment with two kids, a minivan, and the whole, the whole disaster is really, really hard. So for the first few years, I was at Columbia. I basically commuted.
Wow. Yeah. But it comes full circle, right? Because I always just love hearing the stories because how you grew up, all that it gave you that confidence if, your friend who was at NYU just to go for it. Like, why not try, right? And I guess let me just shout out for everybody. We are so glad you got out of public service because all of your gifts that you've shared with all of your students and just even, the reinventing Ireland. Oh my goodness. And I know you're just doing so much more even with your new company. But I would, since you have a front row seat to, students and Gen Z, are there lessons that you would love? I think Gen Z sometimes gets some maybe bad rap stereotypes, but what is your front row seat to kind of the student generation that you've seen over the years and maybe how it's changed?
Well, I think what young people are very attuned to is what is the specific set of boundary conditions that they're growing into,
Mm,
and um, they're definitely not lazy. I mean, so I have a couple of interns that are in their teens, sort of similar to where
Yeah.
I was with George Bisnet. And if you look at what they've done in their lives, even so far, they've got their own YouTube channels. They're doing these creative things. They've got often little side hustles. They've got little side businesses. So I think the path that baby boomers were on, right, was a path that was forged by long-term employment, companies like Kodak, where you had a
Mm.
regular bonus every March and you got rewarded for building up loyalty. You got rewarded for moving up the ranks. You got rewarded for taking increasingly responsible positions, managing other people. Gen Z cannot look forward to that future. That's not the future that lies in wait for them. They're going to have to do a lot of forging their own careers. And I call this, it's part of a philosophy that I call being permissionless, right? Where,
Which I love. Yeah.
yeah.
Please share that. That is
Okay.
amazing. Yeah.
So,
Permissionless, which is
so
great.
as a corporation, what we're seeing is a bunch of different trends. So, firstly, technology is able to do what a lot of managers in bureaucracies used to do. So, keeping track of status reports and passing on information, all that stuff. If you design your tech stack properly, there's no need for any of that. So, the value creation really devolves to teams and even to individuals. So, as a corporation, I think that's going to really change how you look at the people, at your human assets. As an individual, more and more we're seeing that people are able to forge very different paths than the one that would be dictated if you're being groomed to join a large corporation and become a cog in the great wheel. So people are able to access technologies that decades ago would have been inconceivable. You would have had to be MIT or somebody to access some of the technologies that are just lying around for free
Yeah.
today. And so what that means is people can do side gigs. People can make their own YouTube channels. People can be their own influencers. People can craft an entrepreneurial growth path. And I think that's what Gen Z is responding to. They're, in the sense of, are they going to stand by the copy machine and loyally worship the directives of those above them? No, but that doesn't mean they're lazy.
Right. I think, and tell me about the word. So permissionless. That is, how did you come up with that word? Because that's powerful. And I watched, I think you did a media interview on this not too long ago. But tell me more about just the word, because that's a great word. Permissionless.
Well, if you imagine, what is a bureaucracy for? And a lot of bureaucracies are all about control, right? And so if you're running a machine, right, a machine bureaucracy, the mental model, Lisa, is sort of, you've got a hierarchy. The competitive advantage that you get comes from producing mass market goods or services at scale, uniformly, absolutely consistently, a million cars, each one identical to the one that came before. And that's the mass production model. And so the idea is that if you're a cog in that wheel, you have to get permission to do stuff. So you have to, I want to fly to Austin to talk to customers. Well, there's going to be some kind of process that you have to go through to get permission. I need to, get $50,000 to buy a machine to retool something. Well, there's going to be some kind of approval process, right? So
Mm.
this whole permission and approval process is part of this giant cog in a machine. What permissionlessness does is it allows people to independently make decisions. It allows them to invest in, it frees up resources so that they can invest as suits their own best judgment. And it values speed and it values customization and personalization over the sort of slow, steady mass market approach. So it's a really different way of thinking about what people are able to do. What's the agency they're able to exercise? What's the scope they're able to have? So if
Well,
you think about Dan Pink's notion of motivation, what human motivation, and he points to three things. He says people want to have agency, so they want to have control over how they do their work. They want to have increasing mastery, so they want to be able to learn, and they need to be committed to a greater purpose. And I think this whole permissionless idea really feeds that.
Well, and so I have a lot of senior executives that listen to this podcast. So they're probably going, "Oh, that's awesome, but how do I do that?" Do you have any like just initial, and then first, well, I'll make sure to have them get your contact information, but I'm sure there are a lot of people going, "That sounds great, but is there a first step?" Or that's a cultural shift for sure.
Oh, it's big. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it changes what leaders do, right? And so if I think of some of the really modern leaders whose companies emphasize speed over precision, they emphasize experimentation over, deep planning, they emphasize learning over, trying to prove that you were right. They're tolerant of intelligent failures, and there's a whole, as you said, a whole mindset shift that you
Yeah.
want. So a great example of a company that does this is a South Korean company called Toss, which is a fintech company.
Oh, you talked about them at the summit.
I did, and they set up as really circles around what they call the directly responsible individual, and it's very intensely peer driven. So I don't have to have a hierarchy that I report to, but I do have to have accountability to my peers.
Mm.
There's another really interesting company called Morningstar, which is a tomato processing plant of all things. A tomato processor. They process most of the tomatoes that are grown in California, and their whole organizational design is premised on two principles. The first is no coercion. So I'm
Mm.
not telling you what to do as traditional managers do. And the second is accountability to your peers. So if you put those two things together, so if you and I are working together, we have at Morningstar, they have what they call a colleague letter of accountability. So you and I will agree on what I'm going to deliver to you, what you're going to deliver to me. We write it down. And we
Wow.
mutually agree that that's going to happen. So if you do that, right, you don't need a manager telling us what to do. You don't need somebody in the middle coordinating it. So for those that are not yet on this journey, what I would suggest is start small, start with some experiments. And I'll share the example of Fidelity Personal Investments, which is a company that was very traditional, very, very
Yeah,
old.
financial services.
Yeah, very old, very regulated, right? And
Yes.
Kathy Murphy, who was their CEO, their senior vice president, head of this division, just had this nagging sensation that they were too product focused. So it's focused on what we do, that they were too siloed, that, all these fintechs were sort of sprouting up on the edges, and they weren't attacking the business in its core, but they were sort of pulling things away at the edges, right? So the
Mm.
first thing she did was she said, well, let's just understand just what are people working on here? Like, what are we actually doing? So she took a small part of her division, which is about 100 people, and she did a survey. And
Yep.
she looked at how many things were on their plate. So, what were they working on at any given time? And what she found is of that 100 people, most of them were working on somewhere between 10 and 12 different projects or initiatives. They weren't the same. And they were, therefore, any given day, you're on project one from 9 to 10, you're on project two from 10 to 11. Finally, maybe after 5 o'clock, you're actually getting some really deep work done. And she said, this is just a stupid way to organize. And the other thing she found was that that work was really getting slowed down because it had to go through functional divisions. So, if something originated in marketing, then it had to get approved by accounting, and then it had to get over to engineering, and then it had to come back to mine. It was just this whole, what we know of
What's
today.
higher? Yeah, that hierarchical approvals.
Thing.
Yeah.
So what she did was an experiment. She said, okay, I'm going to take a couple of small groups. I'm going to give them inside their groups, they're going to have all the functions that they need. So they have marketing and engineering and
Mhm.
legal and accounting, whatever they need is all going to be in the one group. And they're going to work on one thing for an
Wow.
intense period of time. So let's say it's adding a new feature to the website or reducing the time it takes somebody to open an account or whatever the thing is, but they have all the things they need. They're all going to work on the one thing. And that's all that they're going to do. So they're going to come in every day. They're going to have like a huddle in the morning, and they're going to work very intensely on that day on one thing. And so that was her first experiment. And
Yeah.
what she found was those groups were able to produce new features and new, innovations in 75% less of the time than the conventionally organized group.
Okay, pause and let's say that again. How much faster?
75% faster. Right.
75% by focus. I always, Frito Lay, I grew up in Frito Lay PepsiCo, and focus on fewer things was always one of the key things because, and Frito Lay PepsiCo is a very innovative company. And I mean, that's incredible, Rita, to say 75% more efficiently done by focusing. Hello.
Well, and not having to wait, not having to
Yeah.
wait for marketing to give an approval or legal to say whatever. So
They
then,
had the decision-making authority in their group.
and that's permissionless, right?
Yeah, that's permission.
So that was the first salvo. So for the CEOs and other leaders listening, that's something you can experiment with. It's a low cost experiment. If you're not happy with the results, you can go back to the way you've been working. I mean, it's a no regrets move, right? You can try
Yeah.
it. But what happened at Fidelity was that other people working in her division, which had about, well, call it 20,000 people working, a huge division. Other people started to notice, because the other thing that was happening was these folks working in these very intensely focused teams were just having so much more fun at work. They were clicking, they were working together, they were really getting into customer personas, they were making new discoveries, they were doing all this stuff. And so other people in the company started to say, well, hang on, they're having a ball. Why are we still working this old way? And what started to happen over time, it took time, but over time, more and more and more groups started to work that way. And the thing really took hold when the layers started to get reduced. But what was even more important was the people that were being promoted into leadership roles were much more about coaching, being facilitators, helping these permissionless teams accomplish what they needed to do, connecting across the organization. They were what Liz Wiseman might call, they were really maximizers, right? The maximizing leaders, maximizing potential. And it was when the people who normally would have been promoted up in that system, and you know what they're like. They're
Yeah.
tall, they're male, they're control sort of. And when different kinds of people started getting moved into leadership roles, that's when the organization knew it was serious.
Well, I think when I've been doing all these podcasts with all these CEOs and different leaders, it's fascinating because a lot of them organically are trying these types of things that you mentioned. But one key thing is all these leaders, what they like doing is helping see people grow. I mean, that's at the core when I ask, like, how do you want to be remembered? It's about being the support system. And in that model of permissionless, that's actually what leaders get to do, right? Is they get to do what they love, which is supporting and help people grow. That is fascinating. I cannot wait to learn more. And let's pivot to your company, Valize. And why don't you explain to folks out there what is your company? How long have you been doing that? And what do you get excited about?
Oh, yeah. So Valise is a bit of a passion project of mine, and it started in 2016. And what I was realizing was I would, as I did at the Reinvention Summit, I'd give speeches or I'd have conversations with people or introduce new ideas, and people would be on fire, right? They'd be like, this is amazing. I never thought of doing it this way before. I didn't know this was even possible. And then they go back to their organizations, and the organizations kind of where it was, and they didn't really know what comes next. Is it a spreadsheet? Is it a PowerPoint? How do I do? And so what Belize was founded to do was pick up where, sort of Rita McGrath leaves off and give you tools, diagnostics, approaches, ways to actually make these things real in your organization. So it has a couple of different components. One of the things that I've been working on for years is a software offering called Spark Hub. And what Spark Hub does is it creates transparency around the process of going from an idea to something you could actually introduce into the market. So
Hmm.
there's a ton of software that will help you with ideas, right? You can upvote them, downvote them, collect them, rank them, whatever. And that's not usually the problem, right? The problem in most organizations is not ideas. Human beings are ingenious.
Right.
By the
The
time we're
list.
done with this podcast, there'll be more ideas than you could have in the rest
Yeah.
of the century, right? So and then at the other end, if what you're doing is scaling something and launching it, there's a lot of software that can help you there. But when I looked at that piece in the middle, it's still spreadsheets and PowerPoints. Like if a CEO even asks, what's the shape of my portfolio, right? Some poor intern is running around from person to person to person 24/7 to just even put together a picture. And then within a couple of weeks, it's out of date. So
Right. It's the messy middle, as Aiden calls it, the messy middle, right?
So what Spark Up does is it allows you with very, very little text input. We try to keep it really, really light in terms of the data entry part, but it allows you to get access to transparently where things are. So it's a tool. Um,
Mhm.
but it's a really sort of simple tool that helps you with that. We also have things that help you upskill. So there's sort of a training education component to it. And then we have teams that can help with advisory. So, for example, right now we're working with a large accounting firm, we're working with a big logistics company. And what they really want is to create this synergy between strategy and innovation, which, as you know, is kind of my sweet spot. But what they want is really hands-on, one-on-one with their senior leaders. And so we have teams that can help do that. I do some of that myself too.
Mhm.
What I find a lot is that it's more about mindset and really thinking through what's the system I want to create here. It's a very different kind of consultancy than one of the big
Well, that's
big.
why I knew we needed to talk, Rita, because listening to you in Dublin, there are so many companies out there that I know. I cannot wait to introduce you to some of my friends because the way you think, it's very grounded in strategy, but it's transformational. And big companies need to start thinking more like entrepreneurs because they have to be able to survive that ability, the agility and speed to pivot. And the fidelity example's brilliant in the sense it takes time, sure. But I think if companies, we know bankruptcies are so high right now, and it's because companies can't change fast enough, right? So, but what is the area or opportunity that you're like most excited about? Whether it's, things you're working on or things you hope to work on, but like, what do you get excited about in your future work?
Oh, well, I'm very excited about the software because I think it could be it could really help transform the way companies just manage their operations. And where we're looking right now is how do we incorporate AI into what it does? Because I think it could be a force multiplier for just, to go way beyond just keeping track of stuff, but actually help you think through things, help you document your assumptions, create divergent thinking. So we're busy looking at that. And then I am working on a book, which I'm very excited about. And the book is about permissionless organizations. And the good news about the book is that it's been kind of delayed from where I thought it would be, because if I had published it on my original schedule, it would be obsolete by now. But the book's really about what is this next concept of how we organize and structure about. And I'm almost thinking about, like the permissionless society. If I go back to our conversation about Gen Zs,
Yeah.
a huge proportion of Americans, even today, have some kind of side gig. So if you imagine moving from a world where your career was defined by a company, and your benefits and your pay and your social security and everything was sort of in that model. If you imagine moving to a world where your career is going to be defined by yourself, we're going to have really different models for how we handle things like healthcare, things like dips in income, right? Are we going to see a really different way of thinking about social benefits? And as we move from mass markets to markets where it's all about services. It's all about the result that you want to achieve. It's dematerializing, right? It's going to be a really different way of thinking about what a career looks like. So part of my dilemma with this new book is I'm sort of, my previous books were firmly rooted in that previous paradigm, and this new one is really saying, "Whoa, what if the paradigm changes completely?"
Okay, well, we will have to talk more, Rita, because I have data from my surveys that I have thousands and thousands of interviews from Gen Z on work. And so there could be some even data grounding that, can master that case that you're proving because it's in the data. But my passion is this I also have a new project. People have heard me talk about youth in America because I want to be able to provide tools for Gen Z so it's the possibilities are endless, but the possibilities are overwhelming. And because of that, you can get an answer at your fingertips, but its ability to sift through the noise to make decisions. And that's where, and I don't know if you see that in sometimes in the students, it isn't that they're lazy, it's that they need help sifting through the noise.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
Yeah.
they help. I mean, there's all this stuff about, oh, they're motivated by passion, and yes, that's true. I mean, they are also motivated by financial security. They want, you know, again, back to independence, right? If you're
Mhm.
not financially secure, it's very hard to
Yeah.
time and energy to passion projects. So I think we need to be realistic about, you know, they need to be able to make a living. They need to have some sense of security because it's very hard to innovate under conditions of scarcity, right? So we need to create a sense of abundance for them to be able to really move forward confidently with their lives. And a lot of them don't feel that they have that yet. And yet I feel optimistic that could begin to really be more of a norm.
Yeah, it's that's so brilliant. And I just love the idea of permissionless. I'm going to be really pondering that one. But what I'd love to do at the end is what I like, which are just super fast questions that are just fun. So, are you ready for our lightning round, Rita?
Sure.
All right. So, what is a book that lives on your nightstand?
Oh, at the moment, it's Wiring the Winning Organization, which is about organization design and how you decide what to connect and what not to connect.
Okay, so you're going to have to send me that because I'm going to put that book link in the podcast thing. Okay, what is the most underrated city for inspiration?
Underrated city. Oh my.
See, it's a good one, right?
Yeah, I'd say Helsinki.
Helsinki. Okay, I got to put that one on my. I've had friends go there. What makes it
I love Helsinki.
inspiring?
I love Helsinki.
What about it? What do you like? What do you like about it?
Well, it's very navigable. It's very compact.
Mhm.
The Finns are just wonderful people to work with. They're very inquisitive. They're very curious. The society has made a commitment to keep its members, just to provide support. So things like childcare, education, a lot of social benefits are handled by the government, and business is then kind of free to get on with what business does. And it's a very cohesive management community there.
Wow, cool. Well, that is gonna be added to my bucket list. Okay, so this one I think I might know the answer. One word you wish we used more in business.
Empathy.
There you go. There you go. It's a good one. Are you a dog person, a cat person, or neither?
Neither.
I used to be a dog person. I have no more dogs though. Okay, is there one thing that gives you joy that students might not expect about you?
Oh, well, definitely my granddaughter.
Oh, how old is she?
Her name is Charlotte. She's about 16 months old as we speak, and she's just doesn't get much better than that.
And that little moment, that was a very joyful moment there. The arms raised up and like, yay! That's so, congratulations. That's amazing. Little grandchildren, unbelievable. None in mine, I don't have any, so maybe someday. But okay, so what is there a piece of advice you would give your younger self?
My younger self. Um, um, I guess don't be afraid to experiment more
Mm, because,
because there are always multiple options that you have to pursue. And I think, I mean, all of us have been through the grind of young parenthood, right? You've got two people with two jobs and two kids and, bills to pay and all that. And you kind of go for the least energy consuming set of options when if you paused a little and entertained more ideas, you might actually come up with something even better.
yeah, what just went through my head is the two by two, two people, two jobs, two kids, the lowest effort energy sometimes, but you might miss that opportunity for sure. And then when you think about the last question is when you think about like how you'd like to be remembered, either, from a student perspective or the business perspective, like what would you like to how to be remembered?
Oh, this is kind of a running joke among me and my team. But if I look back, right, and I could get organizations and governments and societies to be like 2% less stupid, how awesome would that be?
Oh my God, that is so funny.
And the thing The thing about 2% is it's not this like huge, hairy, unreachable goal. Like I could be 2% more healthy, right? I can walk 2% more quickly. I could make 2% more thoughtful decisions. And if you do that and it builds on itself, right, over time, that adds up.
Well, I was just going to say it's that exponential change, right? Because if everybody in an organization is 2% better, think of the efficiencies and then your personal goals. If that, t doing 2%. Now I've got to write that down, Rita, because then I'm like, okay, I can do 2% better in my health and wellness. Sleep a little more would be one on my list, getting a little more sleep. But I love it, 2% more. That's a great thing. Well, Rita, this was so much fun, and it was a pleasure getting to know you and your stories. And I cannot wait just to continue our conversations and find ways to collaborate. And if people want to find you, what's the best way to reach out on your
Oh, well, I have a
website?
very creatively named website, ritamcgrath.com. So you can do that. You can also check out what we've got going on at valize.com, VALIZE.com. I have a regular podcast that is called Thought Sparks. So that's up on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. I also publish a regular set of kind of blog posts, articles, you might
Yeah.
call also called Thought Sparks. That's under sort of our media kit. And those come out every couple of weeks. And those are free. You can subscribe so people can kind of come into my world in many, many ways.
Well, I hope to create a spark for more permissionless companies out there, all improving 2% more, right?
That's
And
very
we'll put some of those links in the podcast episode so people can find you. And I hope that everybody reaches out to learn more about the work because more people need to know about what you're doing, Rita. So
well,
thank you
thank
so
you so
much.
much.